Welcome back, my friends, my viewers. I want to just start this video off by saying the following. My channel is not a how-to channel, and it's not a step-by-step, okay, if you want to fix X, you need to do A, B, and C, and then sometimes Y. No, that is not what BBISHOPPCM's world is. We are not a how-to channel. We don't how to step-by-step fix something. That's not what I do. My videos are more, I don't want to be as pious as to say they're documentaries, or documentaries as the kids call them today. No, my videos are more about a particular object, like this stereo here. What I know about its history in particular, where it came from, how I acquired it, how it works roughly, and oh, it has a few problems and here's how I fix those problems. Not, let's take it apart piece by piece. Occasionally, I do make videos like that, where I will do a step-by-step. But I also throw in the other information as well. And I get a lot of people who leave comments on my channel like, you know, it took you 45 minutes to show us how to insert the oscillator chip in the, you know what? Or did you have to go on and on and on and on about where the thing came from? I don't want to see that. I get a lot of that, and you know, it whatever. Doesn't really upset me. It's just I think people misinterpret what my channel is all about. This is not a computer channel. This is not BBISHOPPCM's computer channel. No, this isn't a channel about toasters. This is not a channel about antique furniture and woodworking. That's not. This is a multi-topic channel that I kind of cooked up when I was bored one day in 2007, and it just sort of spiraled out of control from there. So if you're looking for how-to instructions on how to do things, don't come here. In fact, don't even watch this video because you will be disappointed. And after saying that, I think we should talk about the subject at hand. And here it is. Now, any audiophiles, self-proclaimed or professional, watching this video just cringed at what they just saw. Their brains just started to short circuit, and they are hammering at the keyboard right now, talking about how much of a colossal piece of shit this stereo is. And yes, I swear in my channel because I can. Even if I lose all ad revenue, I don't care. It is my channel, and I'm not living off the revenue, so, that aside. This stereo is a colossal piece of junk. As a matter of fact, stereos like this were generally purchased either by parents or hard-working kids as baby boomers' first stereo. No, really. This is all show, no go. This stereo is very poorly built. It looks cool. It has, I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of electronic wizardry to ever roll off a factory floor in Japan. It is absolutely stunningly beautiful. But, as we'll look inside, it is a piece of shit. And that is what it is. I'm just calling it what it is. By modern standards, it's actually built quite well. But by the standards set forth by the big-name manufacturers like Macintosh and Fisher, the real Fisher, not the Sanyo Fisher, Nakamichi, you know, the real manufacturers, Tiak, who else? Pioneer even, Onkyo. This was basically, I don't want to use that. I don't want to say this because I know it's not right. What did I just break? Oh, sorry. I know this isn't right because I happen to prefer the bad one over the good one. But let's just say it. This is your Hyundai XG350 to your Mercedes-Benz E-Class. Although the Hyundai XG350s turned out to be pretty damn good cars in the end. Whereas the E-Classes are, as Scotty Kilmer would say, colossal money pits. Or whatever the hell he says. Start your engines. This is a stereo known by many brand names. YORX is just one of them, but similar stereos from the same OEM manufacturer were sold under names such as Lennox Sound, possibly even Sound Design, although that was more later in the 80s. But there were other brand names that this particular unit was sold under. YORX was really, and still, I believe they're still around, they were just a rebranding house. They would take products from other manufacturers from Asia, all over Asia, and they would sell them under their own name and sell them to department stores, discount stores. So this particular stereo may have come from Kmart, or I think Kmart actually was a YORX reseller. Basically, it's a game of who made who, which was a great song, by the way. The actual manufacturer for this stereo, and I have to look this up on my phone because it's a mouthful. This is made by the Japanese company Rising, and I will Google it real quick. It's Rising Hakuyo Musen Kogyo. I don't know how to pronounce that. I am not familiar with the Japanese language that well. Rising was known pretty well for their boomboxes in the 1980s, but yes, they did make stereos like this one here. So, let's start diving into the history of the stereo and how it's managed to survive. If it were not for the human power of emotion, attachment to physical objects, and sentimental value, this stereo would have been thrown away in 1981. How do I know this? Well, it just so happens this was my father's first stereo. Well, technically not his first stereo, but I'm going to dive a little bit into him as a person for a second here. My father grew up in a very difficult situation. It was a single parent household. His mother raised him and his three sisters. Yeah. And I think it was three sisters. And my dad was one of the oldest of the four kids, and he was charged with basically raising his sisters while his mother, well, she was basically a hippie, burnout kind of. Anyway, his dad wasn't really part of his life until he was about 16 years old. And it was at the age of 16 that my dad ended up staying with his father, my grandfather, for a little while. And for Christmas, my grandfather, and he was a hard-working man. He was like the old-fashioned nose to the grindstone kind of guys. He actually worked in a Rhode Island weaving mill in Pascoag, if you must know. My grandfather was a shop foreman in a weaving mill, and for much of his life he lived alone. He didn't really like people. He was basically Peter Griffin's father. I shit you not. He was Peter Griffin's father, if you're familiar with Family Guy. Not a very warm and loving man, which is what makes this story so kind of heartwarming, because my grandfather, he really wanted to do right by his son, and he went out for Christmas and spent what seemed to him like probably a lot of money and bought this stereo and set it up in my father's where my father was sleeping in his room. I'm sorry, I have to stop for a second. This is too good. This is just amazing. You guys. Wow. I'm going to continue on. I don't know how I can. I don't know how I can continue this. I can't do this. I'm trying to do this warm, loving, heartwarming freaking film here, and this is all happening in front of my... So my grandfather bought this stereo for his only son, my father, in the Christmas season of 1978. And my dad, he really this throughout his childhood, this is one of the most expensive things he ever got as a gift in his entire life. I actually, just thinking about that just right now, that's probably true. Accounting for inflation, this is probably the most expensive gift my father has ever received in his life. And so I digress. He took care of this thing. This was a prized possession when my dad was a teenager. This was his baby. This was his pride and joy. And, you know, anyone who knows audio equipment will know immediately that this is really a colossal piece of shit by the standards, again, as we discussed earlier. But to a teenage kid who grew up with nothing, this was something. And it was a lot of something. Unfortunately, in 1981, when my dad was moving, one of his friends who was helping him move dropped the stereo and basically destroyed it. And the physical damage was fairly minimal, at least what was visible. There was a little damage to the corner here. It landed right here on this corner. But as you see, the box isn't screwed together, so it's not level right now. But you know, the damage was pretty severe to the faceplate in this corner here, but very minimal damage to the box. The real issue was inside, and let's take a look at the inside real quick. So again, all show, no go. It's a very sparse system in terms of high-end electronics. The damage was pretty extensive to the main board. And I'm going to try to zoom in on this. You can see it from the bottom, and we'll take a look at some point in the video. We'll do that too. There's a crack that begins right around just under the amplifier heatsink, which is this big metal black thing right here. You can actually see the crack right here, and it kind of goes over into this point, extends through all the way to about here. You can see where the crack ends, right there. And of course, when you plug the stereo in, it really did nothing. So, heartbroken, my father was looking for options, and he found a friend who knew something about electronics. Not much, but something is better than nothing. And he said, "Here, I'll give you $20 if you can fix it." The guy said, "Sure thing." And that's exactly what happened. So this friend fixed it for my dad, and this got it running again. But the balance control never worked since. It just hasn't worked at all. But for the most part, it still kind of worked. The 8-track player still functioned, but the you could actually hear bleeding audio from in the adjacent track. No matter what track you're on, you could hear a very faint trace of the adjacent track. So that's, you know, that's not good. The cassette deck door fell off and was never to be reattached. It just would not. The clips busted off, and that was that. And that was all she wrote. But beyond that, it really didn't suffer a lot of additional damage. And it did work thanks to the repairs, but again, the balance control just doesn't do a thing. You do get true stereo separation, which is, you know, that's good. Anyway, so this stereo kind of remained in my dad's life. Actually, it's still in his life today. We just haven't brought it back to him yet. When my father married my mom, I was born. This was the household stereo. This was what was sitting in the living room on a tall wooden shelf. And I'm going to try to find pictures of this stereo back in the day as it was originally displayed. I think I can pull that off. I must have some around here in the house. I'll take a look. The thing is, I remember as a young kid, 3 years old or so, when I noticed it. Actually, I noticed the stereo when I was as young as 2 years old. The stereo has always been in my life. It's always been somewhere, and it was always an object of curiosity to a young BBISHOPPCM. In fact, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, I, like every kid these days, and even back then, I would wake up before everybody else. I'd wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I want juice, goddammit. So what I would do is I would stumble my way down the stairs one morning, and this would have been 1986 or so. I would stumble down the stairs as a little short 3-year-old toddler would, and I was out of my crib by this point. I think I got my big boy bed when I was about 3, maybe 4. I don't know. 3 or 4. I don't remember the date. Okay, I walked down the stairs, and nobody was awake. My parents were fast asleep, but I was an only child, so hey, got the house to myself. I'm like, what's that guy with the you know? Anyway, what the hell movie was that? Anyway. So I looked up, and I would have been like this tall, and I'm looking up at this. Well, let's get the angle of attack here. So I was probably this short, and I'm looking up, and I'm like, oh my god, wow! And I knew from a young age that you never touch Dad's stereo. You just don't. You look, you little boys who touch Dad's stereo don't grow up to be adults who have their own YouTube channels. That was the rule in the house. See. And my dad was, he knew YouTube was going to be a thing. So he's like, if you touch my stereo, you will not get to grow up and buy a shitty house and rebuild it and have a YouTube channel. He said that to me. He really did. Anyway, so imagine you're like this, you're like looking up at this thing, and like, look at how massive, and it's like, I gotta touch the buttons. Look at all the buttons. I gotta touch them all. And I'm reaching up, blah, 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 you know, just kind of poking buttons, and look at these, ding, ding, ding. Look at these things. I mean, just screaming for little kids to just play with these little knobs and buttons and dials, and they make noise when you turn them, just like the toys I had in my crib when I had a crib. And it's just like, wow. Well, that's the toaster doing that. Anyway, so I ended up reaching up, and I pressed the red button. Now, the red button was a button that only Mommy and Daddy could touch. I was not to touch any of these buttons, especially the red one. So I'm probably going like this, woo, you know, and you know what's next, right? Ignition. And let me get that tape out of there. There it goes. Right on cue. Well, I don't have speakers hooked up to this thing right now for obvious reasons, because YouTube is YouTube, and any audio, whether it's real music or not, will trigger, you know, the death warnings. Now, you can imagine that this didn't go over well. I was blasting what could have been news. It could have been Huey Lewis and the News. I don't remember. But all I know is I heard a noise from upstairs that did not bode well for my future. It was probably 6:30 in the morning on I think it was a Sunday morning. And my dad was pissed. Oh my God. He stormed down those stairs like a Clydesdale chasing a rabbit. I don't know what that would look like, but you can visualize it. And holy shit. I don't remember what happened next. I'm pretty sure I blocked it out. According to my therapist, that's probably for the best. Just kidding. It wasn't good, though. I got screamed at for that. That was like, oh my God, you broke how many cardinal rules? Not only did you touch these buttons, but you touched that button, and you turned this dial, and it's not good for you, son. He spared my life, but I begged and I pled. I'm like, Daddy, I didn't mean it. I'll never do it again. Anyway, we've since reconciled. The stereo worked marvelously to my demise. That aside, for several years after that, the stereo had begun what they called the death of 1,000 cuts. It took about 10 years, but by 1994, the volume knob was starting to crackle. The function selector didn't really work so good anymore. The cassette deck stopped working. The 8-track player still worked, but we only had about 2 family 8-track tapes, and that was it. It ended up getting repurposed. My father could never let the stereo go. He would never do that, not in a million years. In fact, when he dies, we're planning on putting this sucker in the incinerator with him and letting them spend the rest of eternity together. In fact, this whole stereo will float up to heaven with him. My father loves the stereo. Now, by 1994, as I said, the death of 1,000 cuts has already begun. Knobs aren't really working so well anymore. It just started looking dated. I mean, again, 1994, this was, if somebody saw this in your house in 94, they're like, dude, the party's over, man. The 70s are done. Get rid of it, dude. And hop into my new Corvette. Yeah, it's a C5, C6, C4. It's a late C4. Yeah, bitchin'. So, now, again, it became, now it's obsolete looking. You know how fashion is cyclical. Design is cyclical. Architecture is cyclical. It's popular, then it fades into obscurity, then it becomes popular again. And that's kind of how it goes. Not only that, but it only had one audio input. So at one point, we were using this, it was connected to our television stereo output. And this is what we would listen to. We use this as a home theater system for many years. So it ended up getting relegated to the storage shed, where we had electricity, and this was the shed stereo. So when we were working on the lawnmower, the snowblower, we'd be in the shed listening to this stereo while we were choking on carbon monoxide fumes from the salamander heater that we would use to heat the shed. Memories never fade away. So this stereo, it just kind of got downgraded, but it was still there. It still kind of worked. It still had a functioning AM/FM tuner. Thank God. Rock 101 WGIR was blasting from this guy for several years beyond that point. By the time 2003 rolled around, the stereo was just about 20 years old or so. Yeah, roughly. A little over 20 years old. The only thing that worked was the AM/FM tuner, and that was it. And volume was spotty at best. You kind of had to really fiddle with it. It ended up being placed in my dad's garage when he moved to the house that they're actually now selling. And that's where it sat until I gave my father a boombox that I had kind of fixed up for this YouTube channel a couple years back. It had a remote control and everything that he wanted, and everything worked on it. CD, cassette, AM/FM radio, all the 9 yards. At that point, I would say 2010 or so, my dad took his childhood prized possession and he put it down in the basement. Now, let me draw a picture for you here. My parents' basement currently is an 1860s dirt basement, unfinished, of course, with granite walls. They have a granite foundation. Now, granite foundations were built very loosely. They didn't put mortar between the blocks. They just stacked the blocks, made them level, built a house, and that was it. They didn't mortar the joints or seal it up in any way. And every time it rains, these granite walls become a water feature, like something you'd see in a high-end hotel, only much sadder. And what would happen is water would cascade down the walls and pool up in the dirt and then sink into the ground. And that's just how it was for, nearly 200 years. Well, this stereo was down in that basement on a dry shelf, but in a very humid humid as hell location. Doesn't bode well for its future. But here it is. It survived. How it survived is sheer miracle, but it actually has to do with the materials that were used in the construction of this unit. The outer casing, instead of making it out of particle board, they actually made it out of Luan and plywood. I mean, particle board would have warped beyond recognition. It would have collapsed. Nothing, like no particle board anything could ever survive down there. It would swell up, the laminate would peel off, and it would be curtains for this unit. But somehow it survived, including the masonite bottom board, which we'll be taking off in a few minutes. And that, my friends, is how I found it. This thing was down in the basement. It was dirty. It was grimy. It was covered in dust and filth. And my dad and I were cleaning out the basement because they were putting the house in the market and they needed to get some junk out of there. And I'm like, Dad, what do you want to do with your old stereo? He's like, well, do you think you could fix it? And I said, would I? Shit. Of course I would. I'll give it a try. I'll do what I can. Now, I've already made all the repairs to this stereo. I've done everything I can do to make it better again. And I'm going to talk about how I did it, what I did, what I used, what materials I used, and do a general discussion of really how bad it really was. Okay, let's get on with it. So let's talk about how I cleaned it. Now, this has an anodized aluminum faceplate. Actually, technically two separate faceplates. So this stereo was actually sold, I believe, under a variety of different makes, but there were two main versions of this stereo sold under the YORX nameplate that I'm aware of. And there was this, we're going to call this the deluxe model. And the model number, which I will put in the title of this video, is M2612. The M2612 had the optional AM/PM. Why did I even say that? It has a built-in clock timer system. You can use this as an alarm clock. It will turn itself on and off at preset times. What it lacks is a battery backup, so that when you disconnect the power, it does lose all time settings. But it also tracks the date. Of course, you'll have to adjust it for leap years and such, months that don't have 31 days in them. And anyway, so that was an optional upgrade, if you will, based on, or depending on which model you bought. And if you look at how it's constructed, it is totally modular. The entire top section can be removed, and you can downgrade your deluxe model to a standard model and vice versa. It just plugs in two locations right here by the power board. This is where it controls this relay. This is your power on-off relay, and you've got this is a relay contactor as well. And actually, something like I believe what this does is this is your relay on-off wire, and then you've got power and whatnot. You'll notice there are no audio controls above this line, and that is to ensure that it is completely a separate unit, can be taken off at any time. So cleaning the faceplate was pretty straightforward. What I used was quadruple zero steel wool, WD-40, and I just lightly buffed the metal horizontally, never going vertically. As you'll notice, there is a distinct horizontal grain pattern imprinted in the metal during the milling process. And you don't want to rub too hard on it because it is anodized and you can ruin the anodized finish. All clear plastics were buffed and cleaned with Meguiar's Plast X. Now, I'm not getting paid for using any of these chemicals and mentioning their names on my channel. This is just what I use, and I find that the product works. And I like to share that information even though I'm not getting paid to do so. So all clear plastic was cleaned that way, and it actually took away a lot of grime and swirl marks while leaving the plastic nice and shiny. And for cloth, I used a microfiber cleaning cloth. First, I used one of my ratty looking ones, and I did the buffing process, and then I took a clean one and I just buffed it by hand. The cassette door was an easy fix. I actually glued it back on, and for that I used Loctite Ultra Control Gel. What I like about Loctite Ultra Control Gel, and I have the bottle here somewhere. Ultra Gel Control. This stuff here is, it's a lot friendlier, I find, to especially clear plastics. What happens is, with general inexpensive glues like Crazy Glue, they will, the acetone in the glue will kind of outgas and discolor the plastic much farther away from the repair area than you'd hope. I find that this stuff doesn't do that. It doesn't have the overpowering scent of acetone and other harmful substances, methyl ethyl ketone or whatever the hell they're using. It bonds to plastics much better than Crazy Glue. It also takes a bit longer to cure, which is actually part of it, the magic in it. So you can bond two things together and they don't immediately fuse. So you have a little bit of a window there to shift things around. As a matter of fact, I've had more luck fixing plastics with Ultra Gel Control than I've had with any other glues. And I've tried quite a few over the years. This one works the best for me, for my purposes. This particular, this one kind of became, this is an age-related issue rather than any particular incident, but this entire faceplate, which is mounted within the faceplate, it was originally held with it was held in position with adhesives, and over time those adhesives have broken down, and the entire faceplate was kind of flopping inside here. It was just sort of sitting cockeyed behind the actual faceplate. And this is probably one of the most unorthodox repairs I've ever made on something like this, but I have a reason for it. I went into this project with the explicit plan of not disassembling anything that I don't have to. You got to realize that on items like this stereo, they were made very cheaply, and taking any one particular component apart is generally going to open up another can of worms. It may cause problems. Removing screws, for example, could cause plastic components to crumble, and I really didn't want to get into that. So rather than tear the entire faceplate or this entire top section apart, which is what I would have to do, I looked for other opportunities or other options. I've been experimenting with this Loctite Power Grab Ultimate for various projects around the house for a while, and I've discovered that it has massive holding power on just about every surface I've used it on. I've used this stuff on exterior vinyl trim, and it holds really well. And I'm thinking, what do I have that might solve this problem? And I immediately went back to this. This stuff right here sets up, it's flexible, so it's a little pliable, and it bonds so well. So I just put a few daubs of the Loctite in areas where it would hold this panel in place. So here, I put a nice bead of it here. It's not the nicest bead, but it works. And then I shoved some down in here. And guess what? It solved the problem. This is now one with the faceplate. And you can get it off if you have to take it apart for other reasons. You can get it apart. It's not very easy, but it can be done in a pinch. So there's that. So we've solved those problems right off the bat. Let's talk about one of the more prolific issues that was plaguing the stereo. And then we're going to get into some more interesting repairs. So one good way to tell if you have a low-end stereo versus a high-end stereo is count the number of buttons and knobs. No, really. The lower-end equipment almost always has more buttons and knobs than it needs to. It makes it look more impressive, and it leads to more sales because young kids who see this in the store say, "Mommy, Mommy, buy me, buy me." Because who wouldn't want more buttons and knobs on their stereo? I mean, well, kids are just, they love gadgets, you know? And this thing has way more buttons than it needs. The problem with this is the more buttons and knobs and switches and dials, the more problems down the road. Because all analog rotary dials and tuners and such, they always develop problems, right? Dust, carbon buildup, corrosion. These are all things that plague these rotary controls. And the most effective way to fix these controls is to either replace the rheostat or the whichever mechanism they use to do their job. Simply outright replace the component altogether, or take it apart and clean it. Well, replacement isn't really something I was looking into. That was kind of off the table from day one. But cleaning was an option. And as I stated earlier, disassembly of this stereo is definitely not something I want to get into. Because if you look at how it's constructed, most of the components are not connected with plugs. They're connected by direct soldering. There are a few exceptions. There are a few plug-in connectors on this unit, but most of them are soldered directly. And taking the entire faceplate apart to access those rotary controls, I'm not doing that. That was not going to happen for me. So, what other options do I have? Very few, in fact. So, I decided to do a little experiment. I have a can of this Deoxit D100 spray. In full disclosure, I received this can for free from the makers of Deoxit. They sent me several products as a way to kind of expand the awareness of their product catalog, and, well, this is my way of saying thank you. They wanted me to feature these on a YouTube channel, and here we are 5 years later doing exactly that. So the D100 particularly is an excellent product because it doesn't spray like a typical aerosol can. It doesn't just, making a mess. This is a carefully metered dosage type spray. I'll show you what I mean. It just sprays a little bit each time. It's not a continuous spray. So what you do is you kind of do a couple of pumps of the stuff into a particular switch or dial, and you do it a few times, and you work the dial or switch, and you do it again. And I'm telling you right now, this stuff, this alone did the most work. It was the most effective thing I've ever used on it. Let me explain. So, for example, the function control is a racked switch. It's actually a slide switch that is geared with a rack and pinion style control. Now, I can't just take that apart and get my Q-tips in there and start. No, it can't do that. It's not really going to happen for me. So what I did is I sprayed this stuff into every port and orifice in that mechanism that I could find. And I put a couple pumps here, a couple pumps there. I worked the switch back and forth, a couple of pumps here and here and here, and do it again. And wouldn't you know it, it restored 100% functionality to this stereo. That alone. Because it just had some corrosion, it had some dust, it had, just general wear and tear from the contacts from 40 years of existence. Deoxit D100 cleaned that switch, and it works perfectly every time. I cannot believe that worked. And then I got a little bit cocky. Volume control doesn't work so good. It crackles. I took this D100, and if you look down here, I'm going to zoom in on it. there is the volume rheostat. And if you look, the board right here, that board is visible. And you can get the spray nozzle right on that. And if I spray the board well enough, this stuff will dribble down the board right onto the contact surface itself, and it will do its little Alka-Seltzer style fizziness, and it will clean the contacts. And wouldn't you know it, after a couple of sprays and rotating the knob a couple of times, problem solved. I know what you're thinking, but BBISHOPPCM. Right. But BBISHOPPCM. Anytime you turn a volume control that's crackling a few times, it clears up. That wasn't happening here. I tried working these controls many times, like cycling them each way, thinking, yeah, I'm going to do this a few times and it's going to just self-clean, it's going to be good. It didn't work for me. But once I got the deoxit in there, it did the job, and it did it well. I cannot say that enough. I cannot stress that enough. Anyway, I'm harping on this. So I went and I sprayed. Okay, got the volume control working. So I'm listening to the FM radio on this, and I'm going to the treble and bass controls, and they weren't really doing much either. There wasn't a lot of crackling, but they weren't really doing anything. So I'm like, what the heck? I'll spray those too. About 2 or 3 pumps in each rheostat, and all of a sudden, I got treble, I got bass. I mean, what the hell? It worked. So then I got even more cocky. I sprayed everything. I sprayed every switch and button and knob and lever. I even sprayed the contacts in the 8-track player, the cassette player. I just went nuts. So now I've got all the controls working again, and I didn't even have to take them apart. That was the blessing, because I didn't have to take anything apart. Just spray this crap in there, and it did the job. Now this is a cleaner. It supposedly protects, so it must have some kind of a... I bet you there's a little bit of mineral oil in here or something like that to protect and coat things. And all I know is it worked, and it worked really well. So then I moved on to the VU meter. So once again, low-end stereos often have VU meters that don't really do anything. I mean, they do things, but not really in a way that makes any sense. And this is no exception. The VU meters are supposed to be illuminated along with the rest of the dial. So if I press the power switch, it lights up in green. But the VU meter, well, it lights up in dark. So I took this little board off, and this contained a soldered-in-place capsule-style light bulb. And it puts out, I took a multimeter to it, and I'm getting about 8 volts out of it, DC. And I don't have anything that will replace it. I have nothing on hand, so I had to order some fuse-style capsule bulbs, and I'm going to take one of those and solder it in place. You got to be careful when soldering capsule bulbs, because you will desolder the filament inside if you're not careful. But that's what I found from Bolttown, USA, and that's what I'm going to put in there. So those should be here fairly soon, in fact. Now, at this point, I'm ready to fix the cassette deck and maybe even the 8-track. Now, the cassette deck's problem was, it was a multitude of issues. The heads themselves were coated in grime like you've never seen before. In fact, it's still not perfect. It's still pretty gross. So I used these medical-style cotton swabs. Now, these are, I got these from an electronic supply store that shut down before they closed. These are they're basically Q-tips, but they have a very tight wind to them, so there are no stray threads. They're very good for cleaning heads and cap stands and pinch rollers. They look like a solid cotton, like a packed cotton Q-tip. And I used simply 91% rubbing alcohol, and I just worked it on the head a few times. The drive belt was disintegrated, and it was slipping pretty badly. So I took the drive belt off, what was left of it anyway, and I actually matched it up to one from a bulk container of drive belts that I bought off eBay. And I found one that fit perfectly. But then I noticed it was dragging a little bit. The tape speed was really on the low side. So I'm like, that's really not good. So I did some further investigating, and I found a couple of issues. The flywheel and pinch roller, the capstan, it was a little stiff. When you give it a good spin, it would not, keep going. So I popped it off, and I cleaned the shaft with alcohol, and then I took a drop, just a drop of clock oil, and I'll show you what I use for clock oil. This is just, it's like $10 an ounce. This stuff is not cheap. So I used a little bit of clock oil, and I put it back together, and I got it spinning really nicely. And then you've got this little plastic, it looks like a circlip, but it's really just a plastic ring, and it slides on the pinch roller, or the capstan, sorry, and that is what keeps the oil from getting through, any residual oil. I then cleaned the capstan again and put it back together with a new belt. It was still dragging a little bit, and then I'm like, well, wait a minute, what about the motor? Now the motor is a regulated motor. It's designed to run at a fixed speed. It has an internal speed regulator. But if there's any drag, sometimes they can't compensate for that. So I took a droplet of clock oil, and I applied it to the motor shaft directly, right into the bearing. And the motor's, oh, there it is. There's the motor, you can see it. I just put a droplet of clock oil on the bearing, and I let it sit for a little bit in this position so it would dribble in there. Wouldn't you know it, tape player runs perfect. Absolutely perfect. So, hooray for small miracles. Moving along, the 8-track player. Now the 8-track player, it kind of worked, actually. It didn't really need a lot. The belt was slipping, so I took the belt off. It's a flat belt. And I cleaned the flat belt and got it working. I got it nice and grippy again. I used rubbing alcohol and a microfiber cloth for that. And then what I did is I noticed that the tape counter was frozen. So it was actually causing a lot of drag on the 8-track mechanism. So I took the, I manually cycled the tape counter, and it was stuck. I just got it spinning again. I put a new belt on that too, and got that working. But then I noticed, as my father was saying years ago, that the 8-track player would play, but you could hear a faint little amount of crosstalk from one of the adjoining tracks, or adjacent tracks. So that's a simple thing. Now, one of the problems with these old stereos and even old VCRs is they use nylon everywhere they can. Nylon is a wonderful material, and it works, and it does the job. It's cheap, effective. Anyway, but nylon deforms over time. It tends to shrink, and it develops cracks. And I noticed that the head retaining device, right here, the head carrier, it had cracks on the top portion of its carrier. There's a screw here. Now what that screw does is it secures it puts a little bit of pressure against this ground strap against the head. But what happened is that plastic began to shrink, and it cracked in 2 places, here and here. Now I don't have any glues that will work with nylon, but I have a soldering iron. I figured, in it for a penny, in it for a pound. So I actually used my soldering iron to fuse the plastic back together again, and I applied just the slightest amount of pressure against that ground strap. So that is fixed. But we're still not aligned. 8-track players are infinitely adjustable because of this very reason. You'll see a little set screw right there. I'm pointing it right dead center in the middle of the screen. See that? That is a set screw. Now when the 8-track player, let me see if I can get power to this thing here. When the 8-track player switches tracks, what it does is it rotates this little step gizmo, see it? raises and lowers the position of the head assembly into one of 4 positions. Pretty simple stuff right there. Pretty cool. Now, you can adjust the position of the head by turning that set screw, and it's accessible from the bottom without even removing the cover. So, that's pretty cool. So I listened to the 8-track player, connected to the only speakers I have, which happens to be this Bose Wave radio, and I was listening carefully as I'm adjusting the position of that head, just to get it just right so that left and right channels are relatively equal sounding and I'm not hearing any crosstalk. So now, when I play an 8-track tape and I turn fast forward off, oh, it was already off. Anyway, so now it works. It even ejects the tape too. That's pretty cool. So we started having some speed problems with the 8-track player, just as we did with the cassette player. And once again, one drop of oil on the exposed bearing on this motor solved that issue completely. It now plays at the correct speed, and it sounds fan-freaking-tastic. Things really start to get ugly when you look underneath. This is where you start to see some of the ugly sides of how this stereo's life panned out. You see all this gunk here? That was me. I put that there. That is actually stabilizing the crack to an extent because it really needed it. So what the previous gentleman did 40 years ago is he jumped all the cracked tracers. He traced them out with his hand, finger, whatever, and he just jumped them. That's a perfectly legitimate repair. But my plan was to kind of double check his work, and I couldn't really see everything. So I had to strip away all of his wires and look at it myself. And what I found was that he actually did a good job. He did it well. He used a very heavy gauge wire. That's probably what he had on hand. Nothing wrong with that. But I decided to do it over. You know, since I had it all taken off, I had to do it over again. And I put it all back myself and resoldered a few things. What I did find is that he missed something. Now, sometimes they'll actually install a jumper, like a piece of wire where a component would go based on, you know, what installed options might be on that particular board. And he missed a few of those. Yeah, or he missed one of them. It was completely cracked in half. So I replaced that jumper with a wire, and that was actually over here, I think, somewhere in this region. So I replaced that jumper with a new wire. And what I found was it didn't work any better. The balance control still to this day does not work, and I do not know why it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. And talking to my father, that occurred immediately after it was dropped in 1981. So we don't know why the balance control doesn't work. My goal was to fix that, and I just couldn't. It just cannot. I don't know what's wrong with it. I don't know enough about how the balance control knob works. In this circuitry, in this diagram, I don't know what it's doing. I don't actually have a schematic for this unit. If I did, I may have some luck with that. The balance control is this knob right here, and you can see where it goes. It goes to this component, it goes here, you know, but I don't know why it doesn't work. And I've double checked my connections, and everything goes where it should go. I mean, there's just no question about that. So it's still kind of a mystery as to why our balance control has ceased to function. It is not known at this point. But looking at it right now, I just noticed. Looks like somebody tried to resolder this point after the fact. Is it possible? Is it possible that there's a break? I'm looking. I'm gonna reflow these. I'm gonna reflow these and see what it does. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Well, that pretty much covers both the history of this stereo and all the minor and major repairs that I've made. As of right now, everything works 100%, with one exception. Damn balance control does nothing. But I am getting a true stereo separation that sounds crystal clear from all inputs and all outputs. It kind of boggles the mind. Don't know why that is. Well, anyway, that concludes our video. I gotta put this thing back together. It's getting quite late and I'm getting quite tired. Thank you for watching and have a great day.